In a life that looked flawless, the truth was waiting to be exposed. She trusted him with everything, her heart, her future, her dreams. But while she was building a life full of hope, he was hiding secrets that could destroy it all. One moment, one discovery, and everything comes crashing down. The love she believed in turns into betrayal. The future she imagined disappears. But this is not where her story ends. Because in the middle of the chaos, she finds her strength. And what was meant to break her becomes the fire that makes her rise. Stronger, fearless, and impossible to defeat. The lesson? Sometimes the truth is painful, but it's also the key to your freedom. Trust your instincts, know your worth, and never be afraid to walk away from what no longer serves you. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and support the channel. Your support is the biggest motivation for us to keep creating more meaningful stories like this. Thanks for watching.
With the San Francisco tech and venture capital elite watching, he coiled his fingers around her wrist, his grip like a vice. He hauled her through a museum filled with abstract sculptures and digital installations, a venue whose rental fee could have bought their first condo, and threw her against a towering steel monolith. Her shoulder blade struck the metal with a sickening crack. Stars exploded behind her eyes. His mother stood nearby, a sliver of a smile playing on her lips. His head of marketing, Simone, stifled a delicate, mocking laugh before pivoting away, the sharp click of her stilettos on the polished floor sounding final. Among the 200 investors and influencers in the hall, not a single person reacted. She crumpled against the sculpture, the room tilting violently while her husband, the man who had promised to cherish her, to shield their future child, leaned in and hissed the venom he had been storing for 6 years. You are a legacy system I've been forced to maintain. You are nothing. You came from a town with more dive bars than stoplights, and you will crawl back there with absolutely nothing. But in that moment, a haunting instrumental melody began to pour from the museum's integrated sound system, a piece of atmospheric music commissioned for his company's launch event. The melody made the city's most revered music producer stop his conversation cold. The older man, Arthur Vance, cocked his head, listening. An expression of pure disbelief bloomed on his face because that melody held a secret, a composer's unique sonic signature he had been chasing for years. A signature that was about to demolish the tech empire her husband had built on the back of her quiet support, the one his mother fiercely guarded, and the one his mistress was poised to inherit. The woman he had just assaulted in the center of the $800 million Omni Gallery was the anonymous composer the entire music industry was desperate to find. She was the talent, and she had almost allowed him to convince her she was worthless. This story is a harsh lesson in a truth we like to ignore. Your worth is not determined by how others treat you when you are down. It is forged in the quiet hours you spend creating, when you bleed your soul into your art while the world isn't looking. And often, the person who appears the most fragile is the one whose voice can bring an entire dynasty to its knees. If this story made your blood boil with a desire for justice, if you felt that sting of betrayal, then smash that subscribe button this instant and turn on every single notification. You are not going to want to miss the implosion. Drop a comment and tell me what you would have done in Alara's position. Share this with anyone who needs to be reminded that their genius belongs to them and them alone. And if you're still here, thank you. You are the reason we tell these stories. The event's live stream cameras captured it all with detached precision. A pregnant woman in a simple green dress, staggering against a metal sculpture. A man's arm snapping back from the shove. 200 guests in expensive minimalist outfits, frozen in a portrait of deliberate apathy. And then that terrible, silent fight for breath. The impact against the sculpture sent a wave of fire up Ilara Sterling's spine, and her shoulder erupted in such blinding pain that black spots swarmed her vision. A single drop of blood welled on her lip, a stark ruby against her pale skin. For one horrifying second, the only sound in the cavernous, sterile hall was the rasp of her own breathing. The composer's music, asterisk, her asterisk music, a piece she had written about the feeling of being caged, swelled from the speakers and clung to her like a shroud. It reverberated off the impossibly high ceilings and wove through the crowd of motionless guests. Not one person moved to help her. 200 of San Francisco's tech and finance titans watched a pregnant woman try to find her footing, and not a single one offered a hand. In a room like this, power was the only currency, and by all appearances, Ilara was destitute. Her husband, Julian, stood over her, his chest rising and falling, his conventionally handsome face twisted into a snarl of pure contempt. His mother, Catherine, stood at his side, raising her glass of sparkling wine as if toasting his decisive victory. And Simone, the marketing director for Julian's company and the other woman in their life, turned her back with a soft, triumphant chuckle. But what none of them saw was the legendary producer, Arthur Vance, moving purposefully toward the sculpture. None of them registered his eyes locking on Ilara, his expression morphing from confusion to absolute, electrifying certainty. And none of them heard him say into his phone, his voice thick with the thrill of a career-defining discovery, "Draw up the 8-figure contract, the one for the generational artists. I've found her. She's standing right in front of me." Just 3 days before, Ilara had been a different person. Not a stranger, just muted. She was someone who had been methodically quieted over 6 years of marriage, until her own convictions were barely a whisper in her mind. She woke at 6 a.m. on a Wednesday in a stark, cold penthouse she loathed, in a bed where the opposite side was perfectly made because Julian hadn't bothered to come home. Again. The sheets were crisp and empty. She had moved beyond disappointment. Disappointment implies a sliver of hope, and Ilara had learned years ago that hoping for anything from Julian Sterling was a fool's errand. She made the coffee anyway, 2 cups, 1 half-caff for herself, 1 triple-shot espresso for him. She toasted 2 pieces of gluten-free bread, mashing avocado on one with the chili flakes he insisted on. 1 cup and 1 plate would remain on the quartz island, untouched, just like most mornings. Later, she would give the toast to the building's concierge, a small act of decency to soothe the ache of her own irrelevance. The penthouse was enormous and sterile, decorated in the cold, brutalist style Julian favored. Ilara kept it immaculate because Catherine, his mother, would often show up unannounced, running a manicured finger along surfaces, searching for a speck of dust like a hawk seeking a weakness. The only trace of Ilara was a small electric piano in a corner, crowded with sheet music from her father, a soft-spoken jazz musician. His face, smiling from a worn photograph, was the only source of real warmth in the entire apartment. Ilara would brush her fingers against the frame whenever she passed. It had become a daily ritual since her father's death 2 years prior, which had silenced his music and his unwavering belief in her talent. She took the bar to a shared music studio in Oakland because her old Prius had finally given up. The battery died last week, a quiet, final surrender. She couldn't get a new car because Julian had reallocated their joint funds 3 months ago, calling it essential seed money for his new venture. She had learned not to ask for the paperwork. At the dusty, sunlit studio, Ilara was someone else. She was Ethel, the anonymous composer whose instrumental tracks were quietly becoming a sensation on niche music blogs. Here, she wasn't Julian's unimpressive wife. She was an artist. The handful of other musicians who rented rooms there called her the Ghost because she arrived before sunrise and left after sundown, leaving only the memory of complex chords hanging in the air. They respected her anonymity, and she clung to that respect, a feeling that had evaporated from her home. Her old music theory professor, Professor Albright, who ran the studios, caught her that morning, his kind eyes crinkling. "Ilara, I had a call that just about knocked me off my stool. a senior A&R man from Vance Music Group. He's looking for Ethel. He said the work is the most profound thing he's heard this century. He wants to offer a major recording contract, totally blind. Ilara felt a surge of dizzying hope, a feeling so foreign it almost hurt. Thank you, Professor Albright. That's incredible. She spent the morning composing, driven by that one fragile spark of validation. During her break, she was sitting in a tattered armchair, staring at the dark screen of her phone. No calls from Julian, no texts, just the vague reflection of a woman with exhausted eyes and a gift she had locked away from the world. Her best friend Lena, a public defender with a razor-sharp mind, kicked the studio door open, balancing 2 burrito containers and wearing an expression that said she was about to start a trial. Do not even try to tell me you're hiding in this sad little room, staring at a dead phone, wishing that Mr. Tech Billionaire in the making would magically remember he has a pregnant wife, Lena said, slapping the food down, because my therapist just gave me a brilliant rundown on the sunk cost fallacy, and you, my friend, are about to get the highlight reel. Lena, I'm okay. You are not okay. You're eating granola bars for dinner because your husband took your inheritance and poured it into his disruptive new platform. And my air quotes are now so forceful I think I've sprained a finger. Let me be clear. When a man proves he's a narcissist, you believe him on the first demonstration. You keep waiting for him to download the Husband 2.0 update when the guy is clearly running on corrupted first-generation code. Ilara shocked herself with a genuine laugh, a sound that felt rusty and forgotten. Lena always did that. She was a hurricane to Ilara's constant fog, a friend who delivered brutal truths wrapped in enough sarcasm to make them go down easy. Lena nudged a container toward her. Eat, and then answer me this. What is the definition of a toxic asset? You're pouring every ounce of your creative genius into a project with absolutely no guarantee of personal return. For 6 years, you've funded his ambition with your emotional and intellectual capital, waiting for him to suddenly develop a sense of integrity. He is my husband, Olivia, a husband who forgot your anniversary last month, a husband who calls your architectural models charming little sculptures. A husband whose mother still rearranges your furniture when you're out. Olivia leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You are about to have his child. You are entitled to a genuine partner in this venture, Ilara, not to be the victim of a hostile buyout. You know I'm not wrong. Ilara's fingers instinctively cradled her belly. I know, she whispered, but the canyon between knowing something and actually doing something about it felt impossibly wide. Olivia watched her, her expression etched with worry. Then she spoke the words that would ricochet in Ilara's thoughts only a few days later, just as her world started to fracture. There's a razor-thin edge between being a supportive partner and being the unpaid architect of your own husband's success, sweetie, and I'm scared you can no longer see it. Ilara arrived home that Wednesday afternoon to find Julian in his home office, fully engrossed in a pitch meeting with Genevieve and her team. They were locking down the final concepts for a massive launch event, and the organic, community-centric architectural philosophy she had painstakingly developed was gliding across their presentation screen like a phantom. Ilara felt the distinct, cold report of a final choice locking itself into her heart. Genevieve had a talent for commanding a room. Her influence was so tangible it felt like a change in barometric pressure. She carried her reputation as a Chicago real estate magnate like a bespoke suit, and her laugh was a perfectly modulated soundbite, primed for a feature in a business journal. Julian introduced her as the visionary who would finance his development firm into a global brand, but the way her eyes scanned their penthouse, pausing on the custom-built drafting table Ilara had designed, revealed everything. It was the detached assessment of someone mentally calculating the cost of a complete gut renovation. So, this is the studio, Genevieve observed, her voice as smooth and cool as marble. The view is to die for. The layout, however, must present some logistical hurdles. I was just explaining to Julian on the way here, our new initiative requires a launch that feels predestined, as if it simply had to exist. It's about building the myth before you even break ground, you understand? Ilara placed a hand on the gentle curve of her stomach, a small, unconscious gesture of defense. She had started to feel like a trespasser in her own apartment, as if her entire being, her pregnancy, was an inconvenient footnote to Julian's grand narrative. She murmured a quiet hello that was swallowed by the room's intensity and went to the kitchen. And that was the moment she saw it. Projected in brilliant high definition on the main screen, which was visible from the doorway, was a three-dimensional rendering of a neighborhood brought to life by Genevieve's gesturing hand. It wasn't just any rendering. It was the centerpiece of the entire presentation. For their new life, for their child-to-be. A deeply personal, proprietary urban design concept filled with innovative communal living models and sustainable building techniques she had imagined for their future. A community plan she had bled for over years, where every single blueprint was a silent vow from Julian that this was their legacy together. The original folder name was gone, replaced by a cold corporate moniker, the Apex Initiative, but the design was hers. Every sightline, every green space. It was the manifestation of her professional ethos lifted directly from her secure private cloud. And just last week, Julian had told her she was getting obsessive, that she needed to think more about the nursery and less about her hobbyist models. And now it was being presented by another woman to investors in her own home. Those are my blueprints. Ilara's voice was barely audible, but in the hyper-focused quiet of the meeting, it detonated like a stun grenade. Genevieve looked over, her face a flawless canvas of polite, rehearsed surprise, like a performer whose monologue had been interrupted. I beg your pardon? On the screen. That entire site plan. I drew that. For us. The air in the office grew dense and frigid. Julian's practiced, affable grin hardened into a sharp, cruel edge. Genevieve, ever the professional, was impeccable. She simply gestured toward the screen. Julian was the first to speak, his voice dropping to the deeply placid tone Ilara knew was the prelude to a storm. Ilara, let's not turn this into a scene. Groundbreaking ideas are in the zeitgeist. Genevieve and I have been developing this for months. Do you really believe that because you sketched out some similar concepts, you own it? This is your issue, Ilara. You're too attached. You get sentimental about ideas that are meant to be assets. Genevieve finally set down her tablet, leaning against the desk with the relaxed posture of someone who has already won. She has an artist's soul, Julian. It's all passion. It's charming, truly, but it's not scalable. Genevieve then smiled, a deliberate, patronizing smile directed squarely at Ilara. I believe what Julian is attempting to communicate is that a truly transformative concept will invariably find its way to the individuals with the capital to make it a reality. She raised her glass of mineral water, her gesture effortless and confident. It's a spectacular design. Julian has a real gift for recognizing potential, at least. The low hum of consensus from the investors was the sound of a bank vault being sealed, with Ilara and her life's work locked out. And the most nauseating part was the tiny, broken voice inside her head, whispering that they had a point. She excused herself, claiming she felt faint, and shut the door behind her without a sound, because even her profound grief was not permitted to interrupt the flow of commerce. She pressed her forehead against the cool stainless steel of the refrigerator, her hands shaking, and called her brother, Leo. She was presenting my entire master plan, Leo, to his new partners on our 60-inch monitor, and he just stood there and told me I was being too attached. Leo was quiet for precisely 2 heartbeats, which for him was a lifetime. Then he said, Ilara, the sheer nerve of those 2 could power the entire Chicago skyline. You get what's happening, don't you? This isn't just him being a monster. This is intellectual property theft. I just have to make it through tonight, Leo. That's my only goal. No, Elara, Leo's voice cut through her fog of pain, sharp as a razor. There is a world of difference between enduring this and winning. Enduring is when you let them get away with it. Winning is when you learn how to use their own theft to utterly dismantle them. And I need you to start documenting everything. Elara hung up, slumping onto a bar stool, the distant sound of their confident laughter echoing down the hallway. She nervously turned the simple gold band her father had left her and questioned if she had the fortitude to walk out of that apartment and set their entire enterprise on fire. She didn't know it yet, but she was already holding the lighter. The next day, Wednesday, dawned with a quiet that felt calculated and ominous, the type of stillness that precedes a carefully planned implosion. Elara woke up feeling hollowed out, made coffee for one, and opened her laptop, desperate to find refuge in the single part of her life she thought was still sacred, her own architectural practice. Perhaps today could be a new beginning. Perhaps she could lose herself in structural drawings and client revisions. Perhaps she could connect with her network and map out a new future. Perhaps she could feel like an architect again. Instead, today was the day they brought in the wrecking ball for the rest of her life. She had a final round presentation for a prestigious architectural fellowship, a career-defining opportunity she had been working toward for years. She sat in the virtual waiting room for 20 minutes. At last, a junior coordinator she didn't recognize popped onto the screen and explained that the lead juror was unexpectedly tied up, but had relayed a message. The young woman looked deeply uncomfortable. The message was that her fellowship application was no longer under consideration. "Ma'am," she stammered, her eyes fixed on a point just past Elara's head. "We were contacted this morning by Monarch Holdings. They have become a key financial partner in our next operational phase. They allege that you are misrepresenting your creative contributions to a proprietary project. And now that their portfolio includes a similar development, it poses a major conflict of interest for our foundation. We must be vigilant about protecting intellectual property." Elara felt the breath catch in her throat. That is a lie. He knows it's a lie. I have spent 10 years building my reputation in this city. Ask anyone in the design community, they know my work. The coordinator finally looked at her, her eyes full of pity. "Monarch Holdings is a giant in the industry, ma'am. They made it exceptionally clear that any further association with you would jeopardize our next round of funding. I am very sorry, but our board has instructed us to suspend the review process, effective immediately." "Who from that firm sent the notice?" Elara's voice was a ghost of itself. "I need the name of the person doing this." The conflict of interest claim was sent by Genevieve Dubois on behalf of their new joint enterprise. "I am so sorry. We can't be involved." Elara stood up from her desk in a daze, her arms hanging uselessly at her sides. Her career wasn't just built on concrete and steel. It was founded on integrity and trust, and they had just methodically poisoned every last relationship. A decade of her professional life, deleted by a single vindictive email, small enough to be shattered by a single truth. In the cavernous silence of their Chicago penthouse, gasping for breath, she saw the glow of the office monitor Julian had left on. It displayed a messaging app open to a chat with Cora Sterling. He was coaching the developer on the historical precedents for the Pinnacles design, giving her Eris's own meticulously researched talking points for the press launch. He was feeding Cora the words from Eris's own publications, passing off her intellect, her entire career's foundation, as nothing more than a script for his mistress to perform. Cora's icon, a sharp, professional headshot, was next to a message that read, "Perfect. They'll see me as the visionary behind the concept." And in that moment, Eris finally understood. The recent rejection letter from the prestigious Architectural Fellowship wasn't a failure on her part. It was a calculated move, orchestrated by someone who knew it was her one escape plan, her path to an independent career. This wasn't just infidelity. This was the systematic demolition of her future, engineered by a woman who intended to own every last piece of the world Eris had built. Her life had been reduced to a heap of glittering, razor-sharp ruins. When she walked into the living room, Julian was on a call, his silhouette framed against the vast, twinkling expanse of the city skyline. He saw her and his expression shifted instantly, a mask of deep concern clicking into place. "She's home now," he murmured into his phone. "Yes, she just got the news. She's devastated, of course. Honestly, it's a blessing in disguise. That kind of pressure isn't healthy for the baby." It was a masterful portrayal of a husband worried for his pregnant wife. "I wasn't rejected because of stress, I was—" But her voice trailed off as he held up a hand, a gesture of absolute command that silenced her completely. The caller ID on his phone read Cora Seurak, and he had the call on speaker, a power move so blatant it could only be for her benefit, ensuring she heard every syllable. Cora's crisp, authoritative voice echoed in the room. "I told you, Julian. Her academic obsession was always a liability. Has the PR team started seeding the new narrative? We need to position this as her choice to step away, overwhelmed by the pregnancy. It will make the transition cleaner when you assume sole directorship of the firm." Julian's gaze met Eris's, and for a split second, she thought she saw regret, but it was erased as quickly as it appeared. "Just a final lighting check at the site," Julian had called to say an hour before. "The launch is in 2 days. I have to get it perfect." Eris now stood alone in the home office they had designed together. A sleek space of glass and steel overlooking Lake Michigan that now felt like a cage. The silence hummed with the city's distant energy. Her hand hovered over the keyboard of his primary workstation, the nerve center of his creative process. A desperate urge to reconnect with the work they once shared, the passion that was now consuming him, made her sit down. It was an astounding lapse in caution for a man as methodical as Julian. Open on the screen, nestled behind his presentation software, was the messaging app. He had forgotten to close the window. Eris felt a chill creep over her as she scrolled up. This wasn't just business. The first thread was a series of reservations for a private suite at the Langham, booked for months. Then came links to extravagant jewelry and receipts for tailored suits, all routed through a shell corporation. The chats were intimate, detailed, and addressed to Cora Sterling, the lead developer, the project's financial savior. She kept scrolling, her horror mounting. It was more than an affair, it was a conspiracy laid bare. Using her own administrative password, she logged into their firm's central server and found a partition she'd never seen before. It contained a second set of contracts. It showed a methodical transfer of assets, reallocating the intellectual property rights from her foundational research, the very soul of their firm, directly to a holding company owned by Cora. They were systematically gutting her professional life to finance their own. The last exchange was from that very afternoon. Cora wrote, "The final tranche of funding will be released the moment the Pinnacle launches. Once the board confirms you as the sole creative partner, our brilliant architect will have finally paid his way." Julian's response was a single gut-wrenching line. "She'll never know. She's too busy picking out colors for the nursery." The phone almost slipped from Eris's numb fingers as she took a picture of the screen. Her first primal urge was to shatter the glass wall of the office, to destroy the view he was so proud of. But then a cold, precise clarity cut through the white-hot rage. Eris was a historian. Her entire life was built on research, on constructing a narrative from evidence, and delivering a final, unassailable conclusion. A hysterical, tear-soaked confrontation was exactly the scene they had written for her. But a professional and public vivisection? That was a thesis she could write herself. With hands that were now perfectly steady, she began to photograph and download every chat log, every hidden contract, every falsified invoice, saving them to a private, encrypted drive. The tears never fell. Instead, she started building her case. Friday dawned gray and cold, rain streaking down the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was 24 hours to the launch party for the Pinnacle, and Eris hadn't slept at all. She'd spent the night in a hard, modern chair in the living room, meticulously organizing her evidence, feeling for the first time in a year like she was the architect of her own life, not just a footnote in his. Julian had come in well after 3 a.m, the scent of expensive gin and a sharp, unfamiliar gardenia perfume clinging to his coat. He hadn't even seen her sitting there in the dark. He saw only the version of her that fit his story. Her best friend Maya arrived at 9 a.m. with a box of pastries and the sharp gaze of an investigative journalist who had never trusted Julian. "Okay," Aris said, opening the door. "I need your professional opinion, but first, promise me you won't write a single word until I say so." Maya's notoriously cynical eyebrows shot up. "Eris, is that a strategic tone? Don't tell me. You finally caught him. You've got the proof, and you're ready to burn him to the ground." "Oh, it's far more elegant than that," Eris said, a grim, determined smile touching her lips for the first time. "I have the entire blueprint. Him and Cora Sterling. They're using my research and my stake in our firm to build their empire." She laid out everything: the secret messages, the fraudulent contracts, the cruel comment about the nursery. Maya, the seasoned reporter, placed the pastry box on the counter with the quiet intensity of someone who had just been handed the biggest story of her career. "Cora Sterling, of Sterling Properties? Aris, this isn't just cheating. This is high-level corporate fraud involving one of the most powerful real estate dynasties in the Midwest. I am going to tear him apart in my next column," Maya seethed. "No," Aris said, her voice like ice. "We are, but not with a story. Not yet. His entire career is built on this illusion, this image of the lone artistic genius. The Pinnacle is his legacy, and we are going to host his professional execution right there. I need the original incorporation documents for our firm, the ones my lawyer has in storage." An hour later, they sat in the sterile quiet of a law office conference room. Her lawyer, seeing the new steel in Eris's eyes, had retrieved the files without a single question. For years, Eris had accepted Julian's simplified summaries of their business agreements. Now, with Maya's journalistic suspicion guiding her, she saw the complex web of clauses she had so trustingly signed. "Eris," Maya said, her voice dropping ominously, "who is Sterling Global Acquisitions?" Eris looked up from a capital investment sheet. "That's Cora's family's parent company. They handle procurement. Julian said they were a necessary partner for sourcing rare materials." "Why?" Maya tapped a finger on a thick, legalistic paragraph buried deep in the contract. "Because according to this, they aren't just a partner. This clause grants them perpetual ownership of all foundational design methodologies developed by your firm for unrestricted use in all future Sterling projects worldwide." The air in the room grew thin. A string of late-night searches on her tablet led Amelia to a small collection of archived articles from the city's Architectural Digest. The titles were a gut punch. "Emerging designer accuses Sterling Group of plagiarism. Lawsuit against development titan ends in sealed settlement." The pieces included a picture of a brilliant young architect, a former classmate of Liam's, looking defeated as he announced his departure from San Francisco after a brutal legal battle with the Sterling family. A cold dread washed over Chloe. She vividly remembered Liam dismissing that same designer years ago, calling him an amateur who buckled under real-world pressure. It all clicked into place with a horrifying clarity. This wasn't a sudden lapse in judgment. It was a well-oiled machine of exploitation. The Sterling family would scout promising new talent, use their daughter, Annabelle, to entice them into restrictive partnerships, and then systematically plunder their designs for the corporate portfolio. Liam hadn't secured a partnership. He had sold his soul, and he'd used Chloe's inheritance as the initial buy-in. The story was laid bare in the cold digital print. There was no brilliant partnership. There was only a dirty, hostile takeover. The entire launch of Aria, the restaurant she thought was their future, was nothing more than the final step in a transaction to sell her husband's talent to his mistress. He wasn't just cheating on her. He was using the money she earned to indenture himself to another woman's family. The sheer, grotesque audacity of it stole her breath. There was no legal loophole to exploit, no hidden clause to trigger. The power was in the narrative. The evidence on her phone was proof of a calculated fraud, and the old articles were proof of a predatory pattern that could destroy the Dubois Group's carefully crafted public image. This was no longer about a cheating husband. This was about reclaiming her own stolen success. "My God, Chloe," Olivia whispered, watching the transformation in her friend's expression. They weren't investing in him. They were buying him. The launch party tomorrow night was a celebration hosted by the very corporation that had orchestrated her downfall. It was Ethan's night to shine. It was the perfect stage. He wanted to be the star of the show, Chloe said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "Fine, I'm going to burn the entire theater down." Back in the cold, silent loft, Chloe rested a hand on the gentle swell of her belly. The aching loneliness that had defined her pregnancy was gone, replaced by a core of ice. Ethan was building a monument to his career on the ashes of her own, with a woman whose family specialized in devouring talent like his. The baby kicked, a tiny, fierce assertion of the future she was now fighting for. This was no longer about a broken heart. This was about a hostile takeover. Ethan would be home soon, expecting his adoring, docile, pregnant wife. The performance of a lifetime was about to begin. Ethan was in meetings all day ahead of the big opening, so she took the chance to organize his office. Tucked away in a subfolder she'd never seen before, marked Simply Legacy, she found it. The final agreement with the Dubois Hospitality Group. The press release draft spoke of a groundbreaking partnership, but the legal documents told a different story. The restaurant, Aria, named for the lead negotiator, was a complete buyout. Her seed money, the nest egg she'd invested, was listed as a minor preliminary loan, already settled. She clicked on Aria Dubois' photo in the file. A stunning brunette raising a champagne flute next to Ethan, a private celebration she knew nothing about. "That can't be right," Chloe whispered into the phone, her voice shaking in the stillness of her friend Olivia's apartment. "Can you check the incorporation papers again?" Her lawyer, Mr. Vance, sighed patiently on the other end. "Mrs. Dubois, the evidence is unequivocal. Your initial capital contribution makes you the primary shareholder of the original LLC. Every lease agreement, every vendor contract, every piece of custom kitchen equipment, he secured it all using your financial leverage. Legally, you own the controlling interest in the foundational asset." Olivia, listening on speakerphone, let out a long, slow whistle of disbelief. "The grand opening is tomorrow night at the restaurant itself," Mr. Vance continued, his tone shifting to pure strategy. "It's for Aria. The very brand your capital established, Chloe. Your presence would be advantageous. You need to stake your claim." "That's my stage," Chloe murmured, the words feeling foreign and sharp. "There's something else," the lawyer added, his voice grim. "The new corporate structure filed with the Dubois Group last week is a clear attempt to render your original shares worthless. He's been systematically erasing you, betting you were too distracted to ever notice. He built his entire reputation on your foundation, and now he's trying to paint over your name. Chloe pressed her fingers to her temples every time he'd called her food blog a cute little project. Every time he'd insisted she relax and focus on the baby instead of business. It wasn't protectiveness, it was a strategy. A quiet, methodical campaign to push her to the margins of her own life. "Mr. Vance, there's one critical thing," Chloe said, her voice suddenly like steel. "My husband has no idea that I know any of this. Only Olivia knows." A beat of silence. "Excellent," the lawyer replied. "In that case, tomorrow night should be quite the spectacle. I will have my team ready." After hanging up, Chloe and Olivia were sprawled on the floor of Olivia's lavish Tribeca loft, surrounded by a mess of legal documents. Olivia finally broke the silence. "So, to recap, your husband, who has spent the last year treating his pregnant wife like a delicate doll, is about to launch a $5 million restaurant named after his mistress, funded by your inheritance, while actively trying to legally gut your ownership stake, and tomorrow he expects you to show up and applaud politely?" Chloe stared at the wall and gave a single sharp nod. "Christ," Olivia breathed, shaking her head. "The audacity of that man could solve the energy crisis. But yours, Chloe, yours could bring down the whole damn grid." For the first time in months, Chloe felt a spark of her former self. It wasn't joy, just a cold, clear sense of purpose. The feeling was fleeting. At 4 p.m., Chloe went to log into her private brokerage account. She needed liquidity. She needed a war chest. For Mr. Vance's retainer. For a secure apartment. For a way to survive when Ethan inevitably froze their joint bank accounts. She typed in her credentials. Her brokerage account balance, securities, $0, cash reserves, $0. Chloe's breath caught in her throat. She refreshed the page, and again, it was all gone. Every last cent, the money from her book deal, the emergency fund she had so carefully maintained, vanished. She dialed her wealth advisor. A calm, detached voice informed her that her entire portfolio had been liquidated earlier that day. The assets were transferred to a new corporate account. The sole signatory on the transfer authorization was Ethan Dubois as the primary account holder. Chloe hung up and immediately dialed Ethan. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice sharp. "I'm in a pre-service briefing. Can this wait?" "The money," she said flatly. "Where is it?" "Oh, that," he replied, his tone chillingly casual. "I had to move it. A last-minute cash injection to cover some unexpected costs before the opening. Think of it as an investment in our future, in the baby's future. You should be pleased. I can't even buy a bottle of water, Ethan. I have nothing." "Well then," he said, his voice dropping into a venomous whisper, "you had better be on your best behavior tomorrow night and not do anything to ruin this for our family." He disconnected. Chloe stood in the afternoon light of her bedroom, the phone in her hand feeling impossibly heavy. Yesterday, she was the secret force behind a culinary empire. An hour ago, she had felt a surge of righteous power. Now, she couldn't even afford the subway. She called Olivia and managed to choke out what had happened. Olivia's response was a torrent of elegant, vicious curses aimed at Ethan, followed by a command. "Get in a cab. I'm paying. I am opening a bottle of wine that costs more than my first car, and we are turning this rage into a weapon. Do not even think about arguing." That night, sitting at the marble island in Olivia's kitchen, Chloe felt the walls closing in. "I have nothing, Olivia. No funds, no leverage. He's probably already had his tech guy block my access to the restaurant's financials. The paperwork says I own it. But right now, in the real world, I have absolutely no power." Olivia walked around the island and took both of Chloe's hands. "Stop that. Look at me. You have the one asset he was too arrogant to ever consider. You have the truth. and tomorrow night you are going to walk into his party, onto his stage, and you are going to let it do its work. What if that's not enough? Olivia squeezed her hands. It's always enough. It just never feels like it before the battle. On Friday night, the main dining room of Aria was a temple of glass and ambition. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a glittering view of the city skyline, casting a dramatic glow on the black SUVs depositing New York's elite onto the curb. Inside, the worlds of high finance and haute cuisine merged, buzzing with the sound of quiet deals and the shared belief that they were witnessing the anointing of the city's next culinary king. Towering floral arrangements stood like sentinels between tables filled with flawlessly dressed patrons. A string quartet played softly from an elevated corner, while servers in crisp, dark uniforms moved like shadows, balancing trays of champagne and intricate hors d'oeuvres. 300 of the city's most influential people, investors, critics, and society figures, were all settled into their roles, utterly oblivious that the true majority owner of the evening's main event was about to enter wearing a dress he had once dismissed as too plain. Olivia had performed a miracle. She'd taken a simple charcoal gray silk maternity dress from Chloe's closet and paired it with a stunning brutalist-style diamond and platinum collar from her own jewelry vault. The dress was no longer plain. It was a backdrop. It didn't signal wealth. It projected an intense, quiet authority that amplified Chloe's own sharp intelligence. Of course, nobody in this room gave a damn about quiet authority. They came for the show. "You look like a goddess," Zara said, fastening the antique sapphire clasp. "So, what's the play?" Mr. Davenport corners him by the main gallery entrance at precisely 9:15. Until then, you are the glowing, doting wife. You don't acknowledge Julian. You don't even glance at his chief operating officer. You just observe. Ava nodded, then grabbed Zara in a sudden, tight embrace. "If this all blows up," she whispered, "you are the best sister a girl could ask for." "Nothing is blowing up," Zara said, her voice full of conviction. "Now go, and I want a detailed report of every vein that pops in that woman's forehead when she gets it." When Hila realizes the company she helped steal reports to a new board chairman, I'm predicting a very composed, elegant implosion. Ava stepped into the atrium of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, a hall she'd helped fund in a previous life, and it felt like stepping onto the surface of Mars. She found Julian instantly. He was the center of gravity, and every other tech mogul and investor in the room was a satellite trapped in his orbit. He held a glass of single malt scotch like it was a prop for a keynote address. He was infuriatingly handsome, radiating that disruptive, easy confidence that made old money want to throw their fortunes at him. His bespoke suit was tailored flawlessly, almost certainly bought with funds from their now drained investment portfolio, and his smile was a bright, calibrated weapon aimed at a reporter from a major financial journal. And there, attached to his arm in a brutalist red gown that looked poured onto her body, was Isla. Her hand lay on his bicep with an unmistakable air of possession. She was sleek and sharp, surveying the gala like a venture capitalist assessing her flawless portfolio. Julian's mother, Catherine, stood close by, sipping champagne and radiating an aura of pure triumph. Ava kept to the edges of the crowd. She moved with the quiet deference she'd perfected over the last few years, a habit of dimming her own light to make his shine brighter. But tonight, her invisibility was her armor. She watched. She listened. She matched the faces of the venture partners and angel investors to the profiles Mr. Davenport had given her. She was examining a massive abstract painting they had almost purchased together when Julian materialized beside her. His voice was a blade of ice in her ear, perfectly masked, from the couple admiring the piece just a few feet away. "What in the hell do you think you're doing here?" "What is this, Ava?" Julian's voice was a low growl. You were supposed to be at home, resting." Ava turned to face him, her spine a rod of steel. "It's a celebration for the firm we built, Julian. I'm here." His eyes raked over her custom maternity gown with undisguised contempt. "Dressed like that? In front of our backers?" Ela appeared at his side, her timing perfect. "Darling, there you are. Julian, I thought we decided this kind of public appearance wasn't good for her condition." And then, a prominent tech blogger Julian had been wooing for months drifted toward them, completing the trap, a martini in her hand and a reporter's hunger in her eyes. "Let her have this, Julian. It's quaint. Almost. It felt like being the main character in a silent movie while everyone else was at a booming, chaotic opera." Ava felt the old, familiar twist of anxiety in her gut. A Pavlovian response her body had learned from years of Julian's subtle manipulations. But beneath the fear, a new resolve was cooling into diamond. It was a strength born from the discovery of a burner phone, hardened during sleepless nights on her sister's sofa and armed by a lawyer who saw the truth. She looked at Julian, her husband of 5 years, and spoke the 8 words that would ignite his carefully curated world. "I heard all the audio memos, Julian. I heard the one where you plotted with Isla to use my pregnancy to have me declared mentally incompetent. I heard the plan to rewrite the bylaws to push me out of my own company, and I know you wired every last cent from our joint accounts to an offshore entity this morning." The sophisticated hum of San Francisco's tech and finance elite died, replaced by a vacuum of pure, delicious scandal. It was better than shock. It was live-action drama, the kind of silence that falls when predators smell blood, a collective, gleeful realization that this implosion would be the talk of Silicon Valley for a year. Julian's face went through 3 distinct phases. First was the raw panic of a man watching his entire life's code being deleted in real time. Second was the desperate calculation of a CEO witnessing a catastrophic market crash. He landed on the third, his most reliable tactic, patronizing concern. "Ava, darling, you're not well," he said, his voice pitched just loud enough for the nearby circles to hear. "The pregnancy has been making you confused. She's been having delusions, poor thing." Isla, his polished and predatory COO, slid into her supporting role seamlessly. "It's why she had to step back from the firm. The stress was simply too much. We've all been so incredibly worried about her." She clearly wasn't thinking rationally. And Isla, performing the part of the deeply concerned, hyper-competent friend, added the final, dismissive stroke. "As someone whose job is to manage public perception, Ava, I have to advise you to stop. This kind of outburst, it's creating a very unstable brand for you." Ava felt the air in the gleaming, minimalist gallery grow thin and cold. This was the moment. The point where her concrete, irrefutable proof would demolish their paper-thin lies. She had the burner phone. She had the audio files. Her hand was perfectly calm as she reached into her clutch to present her evidence. The phone was dead, a brick. The screen was black, unresponsive. The damning audio memos of Julian and Isla conspiring, the texts confirming the wire transfers, the entire sordid plan to ruin her, all gone. He leaned in, his breath a toxic mix of whiskey and triumph, his whisper a surgical strike meant only for her. "Our company's head of cybersecurity is a genius, isn't he? I saw the phone on the charging dock this afternoon. He wiped it and fried the motherboard remotely before our car even crossed the bridge. The money is already being reinvested from Nevis." He pulled away, his face snapping back into a mask of weary compassion for his audience. "Sweetheart," he crooned, his voice dripping with faux empathy. "Let's get you home. You need your rest, for our baby." The whispers ignited instantly. "Poor woman, she's completely lost it. I heard she had a breakdown after she left the firm. Julian is a saint for dealing with this so gracefully." Ela was already in a deep, earnest conversation with the tech blogger, her professional tone making fiction sound like gospel. There's a history of instability in her family. Her father was a brilliant programmer, but notoriously volatile. It's heartbreaking, really. We've been trying to get her into a private care facility for months. Ava stood motionless in the center of the vast, white-walled gallery, suddenly an outcast among the very people who used to court her favor. She was clutching a useless phone, wearing a couture maternity gown that now felt like a Halloween costume, and the invisible cage they had been building around her for a year had just slammed shut. Then Julian seized her arm, his fingers digging into a pressure point he knew would make her gasp. A petty, brutal display of power. "I told you not to ruin my night," he hissed, the charming veneer gone now that he knew he had won. "My deepest apologies for this interruption," he announced, starting to guide her toward the towering glass doors. "My wife is just overwhelmed. This pregnancy has been exceptionally challenging, and we're looking into getting her more specialized support." "Let go of me," Ava said, her voice a low quake as she tried to pull her arm free. "Don't you dare touch me." "You see?" he implored the crowd, his face a perfect mask of a husband at the end of his rope. "This is what I'm up against, this erratic behavior. I truly don't know what more I can do." Isla was there, her expression one of clinical sympathy. Her father had similar public episodes. "It's a genetic tragedy. We always worried it might come to this." From across their captivated audience, with the measured poise of a crisis manager, Ela delivered the final, career-ending assessment. It's a classic case of projection, unfortunately. A deep-seated anxiety about her own diminished role is causing her to construct these elaborate narratives of betrayal. It's incredibly sad to witness. Ava frantically scanned the room. 100 pairs of eyes stared back. A spectrum of morbid curiosity, smug pity, and the cold satisfaction of watching a rival's spectacular fall from grace. Not one person offered a single look of belief. The sobs began then, not the quiet, dignified tears she'd shed in private, but a raw, animal sound that ripped from her throat and shook her whole body. "He's lying! Can't any of you see he's lying?" she screamed, her voice cracking. "Doesn't anyone believe me?" In that instant, Julian's performance ended. All that remained was cold, pure loathing. "You were just the seed money, Ava," he spat, his voice a venomous hiss. "A pretty face with a respectable last name. That's all you were ever good for." And then he shoved her. With both palms flat against her shoulders, he pushed her with surprising force, the momentum sending her staggering backward, her center of gravity already compromised by the baby. Her heel caught on the steel base of a sculpture stand. Her arms flailed, grasping at nothing as the gallery's track lighting swirled above her and the cold, polished concrete floor rose up to meet her. The sudden shove sent a jarring shockwave of pain through her lower back. Her evening bag slipped from her fingers, its contents skittering across the slate floor. A crimson lipstick, a valet ticket, her phone, and a simple silver key on a worn leather fob. The key to the restaurant she dreamed of opening. The key slid across the polished stone, its metallic gleam catching the light from the ballroom chandelier before it clinked to a stop against the toe of a glossy, hand-stitched Oxford. 500 people saw her fall. Not a single person moved to help her. Marcus Thorne had been a titan of New York's hospitality industry for 40 years. He'd built a boutique hotel empire from a single loan and an unshakable vision. After his oldest friend, the brilliant chef Eleanor Vance, died in a tragic kitchen fire, Marcus had tried to find the daughter she'd given up for adoption years before. He'd hit a dead end, a series of sealed records and bureaucratic red tape. For 2 decades, Marcus had honored his friend's memory, quietly watching over the culinary scholarship he'd established in her name. When the small silver key came to rest by his shoe, he understood. He didn't have to look up at the young woman struggling to rise from the floor. He recognized the key's design immediately. He had a master copy on his own ring. He remembered Eleanor's voice from years ago, full of a chef's passion. Every great chef has one door they're destined to open, Marcus. I had this made for my little girl. It's for the restaurant she'll build one day. If she ever finds her way back to this world, this will tell her where she belongs. It's her legacy. Liam found his pregnant wife on the floor of the grand ballroom. Streaks of black mascara stained her ashen face, but beneath the shock in her eyes, he saw her. He saw Ava's sharp intelligence and the determined set of her jaw, a look he knew intimately. Liam reached for the fallen event program, his thumb grazing a glossy photo of the skyscraper model, the design so painfully familiar it was like a shard of glass in his chest. "Hey," he said, his voice a low murmur as he helped her up. "Are you okay?" She could only manage a slight shake of her head, the lump of betrayal in her throat making it impossible to speak. He paid no attention to the flushed-faced hedge fund manager who had knocked her over. He ignored the murmurs rippling through the crowd of onlookers. He just locked eyes with his security chief near the entrance and made a small, decisive gesture. "The car, at the side entrance, immediately." A scene in public was inefficient. He knew the swift, silent work of his attorneys would be an infinitely more powerful response. Liam turned back to the woman, his voice a calm anchor in the suddenly quiet room. "Let's go. I'm taking you away from this. You're with me now." He helped Ava to her feet with the same steady care he would use to rescue a delicate, irreplaceable artifact. He guided her through the crowd of gawking guests, which parted for them like water, leading her past displays detailing the architectural triumph of the man who had just shattered her world. Inside the quiet, opulent cabin of his Bentley, as it pulled into the New York night, he offered her a bottle of water and a silk pashmina. He sat opposite her and carefully placed the silver key into the open hand. "My name is Marcus Thorne," he said gently. "Your mother was the finest chef I ever knew, and I am the guardian of her legacy." The total amount withdrawn was nearly $750,000, funneled into a newly created shell corporation. Ava stared at the bank transfers on the screen, then at her friend Nina, then at her own hands, which were resting on the curve of her 8-month pregnancy. "He said Vanguard Holdings was a small speculative investment for a friend," she said, her voice a hollow echo in the room. "This whole time it was for her asterisk. Nina tapped a line item on the monitor, and he used an unauthorized power of attorney on your family trust to get the capital. The only question now, Ava, is what you intend to do." The faint scream of a distant siren felt like it belonged to a different city, a different life from the one that had just been demolished inside her penthouse apartment. She was the daughter of a man who taught her that in negotiations, you never give up a single point of leverage. But what Ava said next even shocked Nina. "I'm not interested in getting even. I'm interested in ruining them. There's a fundamental difference." Ava's first call was to her uncle, Arthur, a corporate litigator whose reputation was built on dismantling entire companies. The phone rang for less than a second before he picked up, the sound of a decanter clinking against a glass in the background. "Darling, I am 30 minutes from starting a hostile takeover deposition. This better be a 5-alarm fire." "Arthur," Ava said, her voice dropping to a glacial calm, "I need you at my apartment, right now. Use the service elevator and bring your encrypted laptop." Why do I suspect I'm about to become an accessory to something utterly magnificent? "Because you are," Ava said. "And Arthur, bring that bottle of scotch you keep for emergencies." As she waited, Ava detailed 3 objectives for Nina, each one as precise and sharp as a chef's knife. First, Isabel's development firm is announcing the Vanguard Tower project tonight at the Architects Guild Gala. She'll try to spin me as some unstable, hormonal wife. Can we shut that narrative down? Nina's gaze hardened with a cold, focused resolve. Are you serious? With the original architectural drafts bearing your father's watermarks from 5 years ago, plus evidence he used your trust as illegal seed money? We can file an emergency injunction for fraud and intellectual property theft that will halt the entire announcement. Second, Liam used your inheritance to finance it. Can we prove the funds were solely yours? Nina gave a sharp nod. The wire transfers leave an undeniable digital footprint. He moved the money without your authorization. That's more than just a betrayal, Ava. That's felony bank fraud. Third, Ava went on, the architectural firm he works for. If Isabel promised him a partnership in her development company in exchange for the blueprints, does that create a problem for him? Nina almost laughed. It's a career-ending problem. It's a material breach of his employment contract and his ethical duties as an architect. It's enough to have him disbarred from the profession. Ava locked her eyes on Nina's, her own gaze sharp and clear. Good, then that's precisely our strategy. She composed no furious emails. She didn't call his mother and cry. She understood that true leverage is applied in absolute silence. She had Arthur discreetly intercept 3 individuals who were attending the opulent gala. The first was the senior partner of Liam's firm, a legendary architect named Diana Croft, who was holding court by the bar. Arthur approached her with the quiet confidence of a man holding 4 aces and showed her a tablet displaying irrefutable proof that her star architect was a thief who had stolen proprietary designs and embezzled family funds to underwrite a competitor. Diana's expression shifted from polite interest to a cold, controlled rage that promised swift and merciless retribution. The second person was Robert Chen, the primary investor in Isabel's real estate fund. Arthur informed him with that same quiet finality that the project's foundational designs were stolen assets and that a federal investigation was about to seize everything associated with the Vanguard Tower. Robert's glass of scotch stopped an inch from his lips, where it remained for a full 10 seconds. The third was a famously relentless investigative journalist from the Times, a woman who had toppled city council members. Arthur simply handed her a business card with a QR code that linked to a secure data room containing the original blueprints, the fraudulent wire transfers, and the damning proof of professional collusion. While these precise, devastating maneuvers were executed on the edges of the celebration, Liam and Isabel were holding court in the center of the vast ballroom. They were completely unaware that the foundation of their shared ambition was being systematically demolished all around them. They were far too busy accepting congratulations, basking in the glow of what they were certain was their greatest triumph. Then the first piece toppled. Robert Chen made his way to Liam, his face unreadable. "Liam," he started, his voice a low growl, "I just had a most illuminating chat. Tell me, at what point were you going to disclose that your marriage came with a $750,000 conflict of interest?" Liam let out a short, condescending laugh. "My wife. Please, don't worry about Ava. She's a retired chef. She's probably at home picking out nursery colors." Robert looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "I see. Well, I have to go make a phone call." He turned and walked away, leaving Liam with a flicker of unease. On the other side of the room, Diana Croft cut off Isabel mid-toast. "Miss Dubois, are you aware that the visionary designs for your new tower are about to become Exhibit A in a federal fraud investigation, and that your new lead architect is about to be unemployed?" Isabel's champagne flute rattled against her teeth. At that very instant, in a quiet alcove, Liam's phone vibrated. He picked it up, and every bit of color drained from his face as his firm's head of legal affairs delivered a blunt message that concluded with the phrase, "Your company credentials and network access have been terminated, effective immediately." The trap snapped shut on them both, from opposite sides of the room, for different crimes, and neither could comprehend what was happening. They spotted each other across the ballroom, their triumphant smiles curdling into a shared, rising terror. Just then, the bronze doors to the private elevator sighed open, and a man they never would have imagined being there stepped out. Julian Sterling was in his late 60s, wore a custom-tailored suit that fit like a second skin, and possessed the cold, unforgiving eyes of a man who had built an empire and crushed anyone who got in his way. Model. Maya's tone was dangerously calm. The intellectual property clause in his development contract. Who has the final say on invoking it? The primary municipal backer, David replied, his focus sharpening. Commissioner Albright. Is she still in the main chamber? A paralegal, fiercely loyal to Maya, checked her tablet. Yes, she is. Excellent. We're going to pay her a visit. Maya headed for the City Hall auditorium, not towards the private waiting area this time, but straight for the main doors. The same door she was supposed to enter as Nathan's proud, expectant wife. But she was finished being a background character. She was finished downplaying her own genius. She was Maya Sterling. And she was walking into a career-defining negotiation that everyone else believed was a final project approval hearing. She made a beeline for Commissioner Albright, who stood by the panoramic windows overlooking the bay, nursing a glass of sparkling water. She had the air of a woman who had already navigated 5 political minefields that day and was ready for a 6th. Commissioner Albright, Maya started, her voice imbued with the quiet strength of someone who had nothing left to lose. My name is Maya Sterling. In approximately 5 minutes, a fraudulent claim on my husband's Helios Tower concept, facilitated by the lead developer Annabelle Croft, will be used to defraud both of us of the entire project. Albright assessed her over the rim of her glass. And why should I believe a word you're saying? Because my brother, David Thorne, a leading IP lawyer in architectural law, can detail the legal framework to protect the city's investment. Because my lead draftsman can confirm my husband's theft of my proprietary blueprints. And because if you look at the man across this chamber who leveraged our joint assets to build a platform for his affair, you will find the key to voiding his contract and stopping Annabelle Croft from destroying your administration's credibility. You will see him chatting with the woman who systematically worked to ruin my professional standing. The commissioner scanned the crowded hall. Nathan was indeed smiling, but the expression looked brittle, painted on. Annabelle Croft, a notoriously ruthless developer, lingered near him, her gaze flicking toward the exits. A jittery junior city planner was on his 3rd cup of coffee, his hand trembling slightly. "Walk me through it," Miss Albright ordered. They retreated to her private office. David spread the documents across a vast oak table. A tech aide brought the evidence up on a large monitor, showing Nathan's plagiarized structural designs alongside Maya's own time-stamped digital drafts. 3 folders were open on the screen: romantic text exchanges, padded expense reports charged to their joint firm, and the stolen architectural concept submitted for the Helios Tower project. Maya took in the evidence her brother had gathered, files that a source inside Nathan's own firm had extracted from their servers. She processed it all with the methodical precision of a designer who had spent a decade spotting structural flaws. When she finished, she saw her own face reflected in the dark screen, filled with a terrifying clarity and a resolve that felt like reinforced concrete. Mr. Vance, she thought, remembering her old university professor's words, in my 20 years of teaching, I've learned a thing or two about design. The people who steal your blueprints, he had once told her, are always the ones most terrified of laying their own foundation. She didn't need to cause a scene tonight. She only needed to present the evidence and own her work. That kind of integrity is more solid than any skyscraper. She pushed herself up from the chair. Let's join that board meeting. Maya walked into the ornate hearing room and cleared her throat. The room fell silent in a ripple effect, the buzz of conversation dying down from the aides to the senior board members until 36 officials were staring in stunned silence, pens hovering over their notepads. All eyes were on a woman whose presence had suddenly become the room's center of gravity. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady as steel, "I apologize for this interruption. I have several critical corrections to this hearing's agenda that require your immediate attention. First, the revolutionary sustainable design for the Helios Tower being reviewed tonight was created by me, Maya Sterling, not, as was fraudulently submitted, by my husband, Nathan Sterling." Nathan shot up from his seat at the petitioner's table so abruptly that he knocked a pitcher of ice water onto the floor. "This is absurd." He stammered, but the lead commissioner ignored him. "Second," Maya continued, her gaze finding a younger woman near the door, "the professional sabotage and malicious gossip targeting my independent design consultancy have been traced to a campaign of interference orchestrated by Miss Annabelle Croft. She is permanently blacklisted from all future city contracts, and a formal ethics complaint is being filed with the Developers Guild." Annabelle was already moving toward the exit, her face pale. 2 plainclothes security officers, summoned by the commissioner's discreet signal, stepped into her path. They were paid to be immovable objects. Third, Maya's voice seemed to deepen, finding a new resonance. "A legal petition filed by Mr. Nathan Sterling to seize control of my family's design trust, claiming I was emotionally compromised due to my pregnancy, has been summarily dismissed. The petition was based on forged medical statements, and its dismissal nullifies the entire claim." Across the room, Commissioner Albright, the project's most powerful champion, set her pen down with quiet finality and walked out of the room without a backward glance. She was a woman who knew exactly when to cut her losses, and the project was now a total loss. "And finally," Maya said, and the air in the hearing room grew thick, heavy with anticipation, "you all know that the central premise of this entire bid was the public debut of a major new architectural talent. Tonight, it is my honor to introduce the actual designer, a visionary of incredible skill whose work you are about to see for the very first time, Mrs. Maya Sterling." Maya stepped forward from the doorway where she had been observing. She wore the same simple but elegant maternity blouse and slacks she had put on that morning. Her stomach was a tight knot of nerves, a dull ache throbbed behind her eyes, and clutched in her hand was a small silver compass, a gift from her father that represented her entire journey. She wasn't flanked by lawyers or aides. She wasn't wearing an expensive suit. She didn't make a grand entrance, just moved through the quiet hum of the room's air conditioning. Because Maya Sterling had never needed theatrics to be brilliant, she had only ever needed her truth. The room broke out in a wave of whispers and shocked expressions as 36 people recalibrated their entire understanding of the project. The quiet, pregnant wife Nathan had called his muse. The independent designer Albright had overlooked. The sheer talent Annabelle had tried to bury. She was the genius they had all been waiting for. She was the name that would define the next generation of the city's skyline, and her original renderings were now filling the massive projection screen before their very eyes. Nathan's face was a mask of utter disbelief. His mind, so adept at charming committees and managing contractors, had simply short-circuited. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, waxy yellow, as if he were staring at a ghost. She can't, he stammered. She's an academic. She just draws concepts. She has the vision, David Thorne, her brother, said, stepping forward with the confidence of a man who had been preparing for this victory for weeks. The architectural concept, with a patent value of $50 million, belongs to her. The family trust that seeded your entire firm belongs to her. This entire design, her intellectual property, her brand, it all belongs to Mrs. Maya Sterling, and it always has. Commissioner Albright's personal data assistant slipped from her chief of staff's hand and shattered on the marble floor, the crack echoing with the sharp, definitive sound of a judge's gavel. Maya looked at Nathan, the man who had told her she was just a dreamer, the man who had stolen her concepts, eroded her confidence, and tried to sell her life's work as his own. She looked at him with an emotion that wasn't rage. It wasn't a feeling of victory. It was a feeling of focus. The cold, sharp focus of an architect seeing a flawed structure for precisely what it is. "You tried to steal the blueprints for my father's legacy project, Mark," she said, her voice soft but resonating through the suddenly quiet studio. "And the most pathetic part isn't that you thought you'd get away with it. The most pathetic part is that you believed my vision, my entire creative soul, was just another line item for you to monetize." She turned to Chloe, who stood paralyzed by the door, clutching her phone like it was the only solid thing in a collapsing building. "You called my community-centric designs naive, sentimental, a woman's side project, but I have always been this architect. Chloe, the only thing that changed tonight is that you found out my designs are worth a fortune, and the fact that a price tag is what it takes for you to recognize value tells me everything I need to know about your own vision." Chloe's jaw went slack, but no sound emerged. For the first time in her career, the developer whose name could launch a skyscraper was utterly silenced. Amelia looked at Mark last, the man who had methodically tried to sideline her, who had shared a bed with her rival, who had attempted to erase her from her own story. "You wanted to build a name for yourself. You craved the industry influence you thought I had," Amelia stated. "You stood by while she tried to push me out because you believed she was the future of Seattle real estate. But she doesn't build anything real. She only acquires. And now your reputation is worthless." From the other side of the room, a voice called out with the raw, unfiltered delight of a peer who couldn't remain silent. "She's right, Amelia," a woman yelled, getting to her feet. "The sheer audacity of these two con artists could power every crane in the city." A few nervous chuckles spread through the assembled investors, not from actual amusement, but because the unbearable pressure in the room needed an escape valve, and Amelia's calm composure was holding it all in. Staff began subtly guiding Mark and Chloe through the crowd. Mark postured, attempting a charming recovery, spinning a tale of creative collaboration, referencing design principles he'd lifted and inspirations that were never his. Chloe offered tight, practiced smiles that fooled no one. She moved through the space with her head held high, her reputation as the city's unstoppable developer now fragile, knowing that every single choice she had made over the last year had led directly to this moment of private ruin and public judgment. A low hum filled the design studio after they departed. 24 of Seattle's most powerful investors stood in their expensive suits, holding untouched glasses of sparkling water, and felt a profound, sinking feeling in their guts that felt a lot like complicity, because every single one of them had seen the lingering professional glances and bought into the hype about their power partnership, and not one had thought about the woman, 7 months pregnant, who was the actual host of the event. Amelia let them sit with it. She offered them no easy way out. She didn't propose a toast to new ventures or the future of architecture. She simply stood by her main display in her elegant navy dress and told her assistant the one thing that mattered. "My official firm announcement goes to the press tomorrow at 8. All initial consulting fees for the next fiscal year will be placed in a trust for my daughter and used to launch a grant for women in sustainable design in memory of my father, who taught me that true integrity is something you build, not something you buy." The silence that followed was complex. It was a mix of shock, dawning understanding, and the deep, quiet respect people have. When they witness an act of quiet strength they know will become an industry legend. 6 months later, Amelia stood in a bright Seattle studio, placing a gentle hand on the bassinet where her daughter slept. The morning fog over Puget Sound had cleared an hour before, and sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Her new project, a design for an affordable community housing initiative, was displayed on her monitor. The simple silver architect's ruler she inherited from her father felt warm against her skin, catching the light as she began to sketch, connecting her to a past that had shaped her and a future she was building on her own terms. She opened a new file, naming it Project Nightingale. She recalled her mentor's words, "Design the building that only you can build." She started to methodically organize everything, every dated blueprint revision, every email exchange with Mark about their shared future, every saved intellectual property filing. She placed a hand on her stomach, a silent vow passing from mother to child. They saw her as a stepping stone. They saw her as a casualty. They were about to discover that a true legacy isn't what you claim. It's what you have the strength to defend. And she was fighting for more than a blueprint now. She was fighting for her daughter. With a tremor in her hands, she navigated to the city's top real estate blog. The homepage was a sleek grid of high-profile deals. She scrolled down 4 posts and her blood ran cold. There it was, a hyper-realistic rendering of a cold glass tower that was a twisted version of her own design. The headline read, "A new titan for the Seattle skyline. Mark Hansen and developer Chloe Vance announce a landmark partnership." Chloe Vance, the brilliant, ruthless developer from Mark's inner circle, the woman he'd once called his professional soulmate. The wave of nausea that washed over her had nothing to do with her pregnancy. That night, she didn't bother preparing dinner. She sat waiting for him in the dark living room, the city's skyline like 1,000 sharp points of light behind her. She let him talk, let him spin his lies about a difficult client and a last-minute design crisis. When he finally ran out of steam, she simply slid a printed copy of the blog's press release onto the coffee table. "I saw this," she said, her voice hollow. "An audacious new vision. You were right about that part." He launched into a frantic, pathetic defense. It was a misunderstanding, he claimed, a speculative project to attract investors. When he saw the absolute certainty in her eyes, his strategy changed. He went on the attack. He accused her of being jealous, hormonal, blaming her pregnancy-fueled paranoia for her wild accusations. "Honestly, Amelia, you are becoming completely unhinged," he said, his voice slick with false concern. But the lie couldn't hide the raw panic in his eyes. Their entire life had been the lie. There was no shouting, no shattered glass, just a stillness that was colder than any rage. The jealousy had burned through her for hours, leaving behind nothing but hard, clear resolve. Amelia stood up, her 7-month pregnancy a bold silhouette against the Seattle skyline. She held up her tablet, displaying the blog post, the rendering of her stolen design credited to him and Chloe. "I want your drafting table cleared," she said, her voice lethally calm. "I want you out of this home before I get back from my walk." Mark, the star architect who could command a boardroom with a glance, just stared, his perfectly designed world falling to pieces around him. After the heavy front door clicked shut, the minimalist apartment felt vast and empty, the silence making her heart pound in her ears. The image of Mark and Chloe, hailed as the city's new dream team in that blog post, was seared into her mind. The jealousy felt like a physical illness. She was pregnant, and he had cast her aside for a woman who matched his ambition in a world she was no longer part of. Then, a sudden, powerful kick from within her womb broke the spell. It was a fierce, insistent reminder. In that moment, the crushing envy for his life evaporated, replaced by a surge of pure, primal protection. Her life was no longer about being his partner. It was about being the foundation for the small life that was entirely her own. 5 months later, a baby girl named Rose, with Amelia's calm eyes and Mark's unruly curls, slept peacefully in her bassinet. The city lights across the water were now just a soft, distant glow for a world that had become this one room. When a push alert announced that Mark and Chloe's tower project had been indefinitely suspended amid rumors of a lawsuit, she felt a profound sense of nothing. The sharp sting of jealousy was a faint memory, a story about someone else. Her life had been distilled to its most fundamental and beautiful truth, just the two of them, building a new world from the ground up. This narrative is a fictional work, crafted by our creative team to trace the difficult path from consuming jealousy to profound self-reliance. Each plot point was chosen to construct a story that not only engages, but resonates with the painful, powerful process of a human heart forging its own path to peace.